Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen still a fair bit of momentum and activity happening across the housing market, although really that momentum now very much in a downwards direction. 5+ months coming forward in terms of house price falls, expectations of that continuing. Interest rates, of course, increasing quite substantially, moving faster than the official cash rate has moved up. The writing is on the wall there in terms of where those numbers start to head. When we look at the construction sector as well, though, there's a lot of work still on the cards, well over 50,000 consents put forward over the last year, but there's still quite a lot coming down the tracks when it comes to the likes of the housing and construction sector. Really, especially for construction, just the cost that's coming forward is starting to blow out enormously. I mean, you've looked at the latest numbers. How bad are they?
Yeah, cost inflation continuing to accelerate for the construction industry. Residential costs are up 18% over the last year. Non-residential and civil construction costs have risen over 10%. And so all those rates are running at their fastest since the 1980s. There was a heck of a lot of pressure coming through there. We know it's because of capacity constraints and labour shortages across the construction industry. You add in higher fuel and shipping costs, supply chain disruptions as well for materials and shortages of materials out there. It all adds up to just being a very difficult situation in terms of construction. I think that the difficulty there is when you look at that construction cost inflation of 18% for residential in particular, you contrast that with the 10% falls in Auckland house prices that we've seen over the last 5 months. And suddenly the maths there for developers does start to become pretty difficult in terms of progressing ahead with projects. I mean, the one thing we're not sure about at the moment is that investors typically, when they are buying at the moment, look, there's the incentives for them to purchase a new house as opposed to purchasing an existing property because there are tax advantages in that. That may help to keep construction activity up higher than it would otherwise, but otherwise everything is looking like it's starting to turn a bit south for construction and its prospects from here.
Well, it's just so difficult to write to build at the moment. I mean, you're talking about cost inflation of nearly 20% over the last year. I mean, to build a house now is incredibly expensive, and it's just so difficult to find materials as well. We know that you can't find jib for love nor money. So all of those challenges really starting to bite, alongside, of course, the workforce pressures that are coming through. A lot of work to be done, but the phasing all becoming more difficult. Of course, one of the challenges that is starting to emerge is that you are starting to see some cash flow issues with some firms. Of course, they're trying to make things work. They're trying to use the current money from sold development and recycle that into the next one to fund the building and the materials and the people for the next project. But of course, if you're starting to see things push out, if you're not able to access some of those resources, that's becoming quite challenging. I mean, just how dark does it look for some of those construction sector firms in terms of where their cash flow numbers are, and in terms of who's leaving debts behind that are unable to be paid?
Yeah, we are seeing liquidation numbers reportedly rising for the construction industry. I think it's possibly just the tip of the iceberg. But, one of the things that really concerns me is that we've been, particularly in the residential space, the market and the industry has been expanding for the last 10 or 11 years in terms of the amount of activity that have been occurring. We were running well over double where we were back in 2011 and 2012. And so there'll be a lot of operators in the industry who, they may have been in business 7 or 8 years, but they've only experienced growth during that time. And switching that mindset in terms of having to suddenly start worrying about your costs and running a leaner business, that can be quite difficult, particularly if you haven't been through that exercise before. And we know that just if you're a good builder, it doesn't necessarily make you a good business person in terms of managing some of those pressures. So there could be a period of quite difficult conditions and potentially consolidation coming up for the industry, and many businesses will be under a lot of pressure, particularly when you factor in not just the costs, but the sort of delays associated with getting projects going as well. Every day you're sitting around waiting for materials is a day where you're still having to pay your staff, meet your other costs, and you're not making the revenue or the profit coming in the other door.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, it's some of those smaller businesses, right, that are going to be a little bit more worried about these sort of outcomes. Bigger businesses often having a little bit more cash flow behind them and the ability to move around various assets and pots of money. Those smaller operators definitely more in the firing line. That's not to say that those bigger firms are safe. There's been enough examples of them turning bad over various periods, so certainly not out of the woods. The other one, as we've mentioned, is just the delays that are coming through. I mean, it is taking longer to build. That's starting to lead to some of these issues. Now, I mean, there's new numbers out recently from Stats NZ and MB, a bit of an experimental series looking at the time that it does take to build and those various elements. You've had a look at the numbers. I mean, how much longer is it taking now?
Yeah, a few measures put out by Stats NZ in terms of the time between consent and a project meeting its sort of first building inspection right across the spectrum. It's up almost double for most of those building types. So you're talking for a house, for example, typically you'd be 60 days until you got to your first inspection. You're now closer to 100 days. And the times have blown out even more when you look at when you push out towards the sort of completion and getting the Code of Compliance certificate. It's not getting any better. And I think, of course, some of those numbers are yet to reflect some of the more critical supply chain issues around GIB and other stuff that you mentioned there. That will probably come through in later data that we haven't seen yet. What is really fascinating for me when you look at the numbers is that those are the sort of median figures I talked about. But when you look at the long tail or the sort of projects that are slower to be completed, Stats NZ pointed out that for non-residential construction and for residential alterations work, it's close to 1,000 days. So you're talking nearly 3 years from consent to completion for the last 25% of projects. And when you consider that you're supposed to have a 2-year time frame to get your building work completed, those numbers are quite astounding, and they have blown out substantially. So it just reflects just how hard it is, one, to get a builder, and then to actually get the materials and get that building work progressed. And so that just speaks to the financial pressures that that builders and construction firms will be under with those delays that are out there.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot still to unpack here, right? We know that construction levels are high at the moment. There's confidence that there's good pipeline for the next year or so, partly because of those delays. But of course, if you're looking there at a business and you know it's going to be costing you a lot more, you are going to be a bit more hesitant of taking on future work and exactly how you do it. No one seems to be offering fixed price contracts and similar. There's some real variability out there. People probably getting a bit nervous, some certainly thinking about getting cold feet. You add into that all the concerns around liquidation and similar, and you do get the feeling that after trying to make up for a lot of lost time all in short order, there's a risk very much that we tip things the other way, and you do sort of see maybe not the full boom bust cycle that the construction sector's gone through before, but definitely a bit more variability over the next few years at a time when, again, we know we still need to build a lot more, but just making the equations work and the dollars sort of stack up is becoming more challenging, especially if you're looking to build something that's costing you nearly 20% more to build and you're selling it for 10% what you thought you might originally get. That's a difficult one. That's going to be squeezing your margins quite a lot. We'll assess where that goes, where those various construction figures shift, and how long and how difficult it is to build in New Zealand on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.